I rented a cabin in rural Montana one summer with the idea that a few quiet weeks away from everything would help clear my head. The place was tucked back off a long dirt road, surrounded by thick timber and open fields that stretched all the way to the mountains. When I first pulled up, the silence was the kind that sits heavy, the kind you only get miles away from town. It wasn't uncomfortable at first. It was the kind of quiet I thought I wanted. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built out of dark logs that had weathered decades of storms. The roof was metal, and the front porch looked out over a meadow that dropped into a pine forest. The nearest town was almost an hour away, and the closest neighbor was probably just as far. The rental manager told me I'd have full privacy and that it was the kind of place people came when they didn't want to be bothered. At first, that sounded perfect. Inside, the cabin was simple. A wood stove in the living room, a narrow kitchen with old appliances, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom with a weak shower. There was a landline phone mounted on the wall in the kitchen, but I knew cell service was useless out there. I didn't think much of it until later. The first few days were calm. I spent time hiking in the woods, reading on the porch, and cooking simple meals. At night, the sky opened up with more stars than I'd ever seen, and I sat outside listening to the crickets and coyotes. The silence felt heavier at night, but I told myself it was part of being that far out. It was the 4th night when things changed. I had gone to bed around 11. The night was still, not even a breeze moving through the trees. I must have dozed off because I woke up sometime after midnight to a sound that didn't belong. It was sharp, sudden, and close. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch falling against the side of the cabin, but then it came again. A heavy, deliberate bang against the outer wall. I froze in bed, staring into the dark. My heart thumped so hard I could feel it in my throat. The banging stopped for a moment, then started again, this time on a different side of the cabin. It wasn't random. It wasn't the wind. Someone was walking around outside, hitting the walls with force. I sat up and listened, straining to hear footsteps between the bangs. The cabin was small, and each hit vibrated through the walls. Whoever it was moved slow, circling the place. My first instinct was to grab the phone in the kitchen and call the sheriff. I didn't want to step out of the bedroom, but the sound of another slam against the back wall pushed me to move. The floor creaked under my feet as I made my way through the dark to the kitchen. My hands shook as I lifted the receiver. I pressed it to my ear. Nothing, just silence. I pressed the hook a few times, but there was no dial tone. A wave of cold panic hit me. The only phone line was dead. I hung it up and stood in the dark kitchen, listening. The banging had stopped, but now there was something worse. Silence again, the kind where you know someone is out there, waiting. My skin crawled. I tried to steady my breathing, afraid even that sound might give me away. I checked the windows. They were old, with thin curtains, and I hated how exposed they felt. I kept the lights off, hoping whoever was outside wouldn't see me moving inside. My mind kept racing. Was it some drunk hunter? A local messing with me? Or was it someone who had planned this? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in a chair with the fire poker gripped in my hands, staring at the front door and every shadow that moved across the curtains. The banging never came back that night, but I heard twigs snapping outside, faint footsteps in the grass, too close to be wildlife. When the sun came up, I went straight outside, heart pounding as I pushed the door open. The grass around the cabin was damp with dew, and I could see where it had been trampled. Footprints, clear ones, leading right up to the walls, circling the cabin. My stomach turned as I followed them around the building. When I got to the side where the phone line ran into the wall, I stopped cold. The wire had been cut clean through, hanging loose against the logs. That was when the fear turned into something heavier. Whoever had been outside wasn't just messing around. They didn't want me to call for help. They had planned it. I spent the day in a haze, checking and rechecking every window, every lock on the doors. The cabin only had one way in and out, the front door, and suddenly that felt like a trap. I thought about getting in my truck and leaving right then, but the dirt road was long and narrow, surrounded by trees. If someone was waiting out there, I'd have no way out. The thought of being ambushed on the road scared me worse than staying put in daylight. By evening, my nerves were raw. Every creak in the wood, every sound in the forest made me jump. As the sun went down, I built a fire in the stove just for the noise, something to cover up the silence pressing in from outside. The second night was worse. I lay in bed, trying to convince myself nothing would happen again, when the banging returned. Louder this time, more forceful. It shook the cabin. I gripped the poker again, sweating, listening as it moved from wall to wall. Then, just like the night before, it stopped. Silence pressed in so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. I sat awake until dawn again, waiting, listening. When daylight finally came, I went outside with shaky legs. The footprints were there again, fresh. The grass bent down where someone had stood, facing the windows, watching. That was enough. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things in a hurry, keeping one eye on the tree line. The whole time I felt like I was being watched, like if I lingered too long, whoever had been out there would step out of the woods. When I finally drove away down that dirt road, my hands were so tight on the wheel they hurt. I didn't relax until I hit pavement miles later, and even then, I kept checking the mirrors. I never found out who it was. The rental manager later said they hadn't had trouble before, but I couldn't shake what I saw. The footprints, the cut phone line, the deliberate way the banging moved around the cabin. Someone had been out there and they had come prepared. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't an accident. It was someone who wanted me isolated, scared, and helpless. I left Montana that week and never went back. Even now, when I hear something hit the side of my house at night, my stomach knots up the same way it did in that cabin. Because I know what it feels like to be out there, in the middle of nowhere, and realize that the only line you had to the outside world has already been cut. We had rented an old hunting cabin deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for deer season. It was the kind of place you only got to after a long drive on dirt roads, then another few miles down a rutted two-track barely wide enough for the trucks. The cabin itself was nothing more than a rectangle of logs with a metal roof, a wood stove, and a couple bunks stacked against the walls. No electricity, no plumbing, just four walls, a roof, and the woods pressing in tight from all sides. It wasn't my first time staying there. I'd been going up with the same group of guys for years. The cabin had a certain comfort to it, creaky and drafty, but familiar. When we arrived that year, the air was sharp with November cold, our boots crunching through a thin crust of snow. Smoke from the first fire curled out of the chimney, and we spent the first night playing cards, talking about hunting plans, and soaking in the warmth of the stove. The woods around the cabin were endless, just birch, pine, and maple rolling out in every direction. We knew the trails well, but off those paths you could wander for miles without seeing another person. That was the appeal. Solitude, quiet, and the sense that the only things out there besides us were deer, bears, and the occasional wolf. The second morning, as we set out, I noticed something odd on a birch near the cabin. A carving in the bark, freshly cut, the wound still wet. It wasn't initials or a symbol, but a date. I leaned closer, reading it. It was the exact day we had arrived. At first, I thought one of the guys had done it as a joke. Hunters sometimes leave their marks on trees, though we usually avoided it. But this was fresh, and the cuts were sharp, like whoever did it had been there within hours. I didn't say anything right then. I just brushed it off and kept moving with the group, but the image stuck with me. That night, after a long day in the woods, we came back tired and cold. While grabbing firewood, I spotted another carving on a pine not far from the cabin. Another date. At first I thought maybe it was the same one. But no, it was different. This one matched the day we were scheduled to leave. I felt my chest tighten. My first thought was that one of us was messing around, trying to spook the others. But the dates were too specific. Not just November 15th or opening day, but the exact span of our trip, carved into trees right where we could see them. The next morning, I made a point of checking the trees around camp before heading out. I found more. 3 of them, all within sight of the cabin. Each one had the same dates carved into the bark. The day we arrived and the day we were supposed to leave, cut side by side like bookends. The cuts were deep, precise, and fresh enough that wood shavings still clung to the grooves. Whoever made them had done it very recently. Too recently. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I pointed them out to the others. Nobody admitted to doing it, and the mood shifted. The laughter from the night before was gone. Everyone got quiet, and though nobody said it out loud, we all knew the truth. Someone else had been there, close to our cabin, marking the exact days of our stay. That day in the woods, I couldn't focus on hunting. Every sound made me whip my head around. A crack of a branch, a movement of shadow, even the wind. It all set me on edge. I kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight, watching. But there was nothing. When we got back that evening, the unease was heavier. We checked the cabin, the gear, even our trucks. Nothing was touched, nothing missing. But the trees were still there, the dates glaring back at us in raw, pale cuts against the bark. That night, none of us slept well. The wind rattled the metal roof, the stove groaned, and every creak in the cabin felt louder than usual. I lay awake, staring at the rafters, thinking about those carvings. Someone had known we were coming. Someone had been close enough to mark the trees without us noticing. And they knew exactly when we planned to leave. The next morning, one of the guys found another carving, farther down the trail. It wasn't just the dates anymore. This time there was something else. A line scratched underneath like a dash or a tally mark. None of us could figure out what it meant. But the fact that there were new carvings, ones that hadn't been there before, shook us worse than anything else. Whoever was doing this wasn't done. They were still out there, close enough to keep marking the woods while we were asleep or away hunting. The group got tense. Nobody wanted to admit how much it rattled them, but I could see it in their faces. Hunting didn't feel the same anymore. Instead of watching for deer, I kept scanning the tree line for movement. My ears strained for footsteps instead of rustling leaves. The woods didn't feel empty anymore. They felt occupied. On the 5th day, we made a decision. None of us said it outright, but we cut the trip short. The hunting wasn't good, and the unease was eating at us. Packing up felt heavier than usual. Every trip from the cabin to the truck, I felt eyes on me, though the woods stayed silent. Before we left, I did one last slow circle around the cabin. I stopped at each tree, staring at the dates carved deep into the bark. Our arrival date, our departure date, every mark cut clean, deliberate, and fresh. I touched one with my glove, feeling the rough edges. Whoever had made them had known everything. When we came, when we'd go, how long we'd be there. As I climbed into the truck, I realized what unsettled me most. It wasn't just that someone had carved the dates. It was that they hadn't done anything else. No threats, no damage, no direct contact. Just silent marks in the trees, reminding us we weren't alone, that someone else had been keeping track of us every single day. We drove out, the cabin shrinking behind the trees. No one said much on the ride home, but I know I wasn't the only one replaying it in my head, over and over. Those pale wounds in the bark, marking our time like someone counting down. I never went back to that cabin again. None of us did. And to this day, I still don't know what unsettles me more. Whether those carvings were meant as a warning, or whether they were something worse. A record, proof that someone had been close enough to watch us the whole time and wanted us to know it. I booked a cabin in Maine for a long weekend, thinking it would be a quiet escape from everything. I wanted woods, water, and time away from work. The place I found online looked perfect. A small log cabin not far from a lake, surrounded by pines, with a deck that overlooked the water. The photos showed rustic wood walls inside, a stone fireplace, and simple furniture. It looked cozy, not fancy, but that was exactly what I wanted. The drive there took me deeper into narrow roads until the pavement turned to gravel. Trees closed in on both sides, and for a while I didn't see another car. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The air was cool, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled everything. From the outside, the cabin was even more weathered than the photos, with patches of moss clinging to the logs and shutters hanging a little crooked. Still, it felt private and quiet, just as I had hoped. Inside, the cabin was dim. The walls were made of thick wood paneling, darkened by age. The floor creaked with every step. There was a small living room with a couch facing the fireplace, a little kitchen tucked to the side, and a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. Everything had a musty smell, like the place had been shut up for too long. I opened windows to let the air in, then unloaded my bag. That first evening was uneventful. I cooked something simple, sat outside on the deck with a book, and listened to the loons calling on the lake. As the sun went down, the forest turned dark fast, and the only light came from the cabin windows and the thin glow of the moon. It felt isolated, but I told myself that was what I wanted. It was the second day when I noticed something strange. The morning light came in low through the window, and I was sitting in the living room drinking coffee. The walls had dozens of knots in the wood, some big, some small. I wasn't really paying attention until one knot caught my eye. It wasn't the shape that made me stare. It was the way the light hit it. There was a tiny glint in the center, a reflection that didn't look right. At first, I thought it was just the polish of the wood catching the sun. But as I leaned closer, the reflection sharpened. It looked like glass, perfect little circle. My stomach dropped as the thought clicked into place. It wasn't just a knot, it was a lens. I froze there, staring at it. My skin prickled. It was so small I never would have noticed if the sun hadn't hit it at the right angle. I leaned even closer, heart pounding, and saw the dark hollow behind it. There was no question. It was a camera hidden inside the wall. I stepped back fast, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the coffee cup. My mind raced. Who put it there? How many others were in the cabin? And worse, how long had it been recording? I suddenly hated how exposed I felt. Every room had those knots. Every single one could be hiding another lens. I moved carefully, scanning the walls, the corners, the beams above. I didn't touch the camera I found. I was too afraid to, like it might alert someone that I had noticed. Instead, I tried to look casual as I walked from room to room, but inside I was spiraling. The bedroom was worse. The walls were covered in the same knotty wood, and as I inspected closer, I caught another faint reflection near the bed. Another lens, aimed directly at where someone would be sleeping. My throat went dry. I checked the bathroom next. The mirror was old and slightly warped, but I couldn't stop thinking about what could be behind it. My eyes darted to the paneling by the shower, and sure enough, there was another faint shine in the wood. I felt sick. Whoever set this up had thought of everything. They weren't just watching. They had hidden cameras in the most private places. I couldn't sit still. I began looking for wires, some kind of evidence of where they went. In the back closet, behind cleaning supplies, I found a hole cut into the paneling. Inside, hidden between the studs, was a small box with wires running from it. I didn't touch it, but I could see faint lights blinking. The cameras weren't just props. They were powered. They were working. I backed away, my hands sweating, my heart pounding. My first instinct was to call the police, but I remembered I had no signal out here. The landline in the kitchen suddenly seemed suspicious. What if it wasn't even connected? What if whoever set this up was still watching, waiting? The idea that someone could be sitting somewhere close by, right then watching everything I did, made me feel sick. I thought about the drive-in, the long, narrow road with no neighbors, no one nearby. I thought about how easy it would be for someone to show up without me hearing until it was too late. I knew I had to leave, right then. No waiting, no packing, just go. I grabbed my keys and shoved my bag into the truck without checking if I left anything behind. Every second I stayed, I felt eyes on me. I kept expecting a car to pull up or footsteps to come from the trees. I didn't look back at the cabin as I sped down the gravel road, tires skidding on the loose stones. When I finally reached town, my phone got signal again. I pulled into a gas station and sat there, shaking before I called the sheriff. I explained everything, every detail, from the lens in the knot to the wires in the wall. They sent someone to meet me, and later, when they went to check the cabin, they confirmed what I already knew. There were multiple cameras hidden in the walls. Small, wireless ones disguised behind the knots of the wood paneling. Whoever had put them there had done it carefully, with time and precision. The sheriff told me it wasn't the first time something like that had happened in rental cabins. Sometimes the owner was involved, sometimes it was someone who had access before the guests arrived. He didn't say much else, but the way he avoided my eyes told me enough. Someone had been watching me, recording me. I left Maine the next day. I couldn't stand the thought of staying even one more night in that area. On the drive out, I kept checking the mirrors, half convinced I'd see a car following me. Even after I got home, the unease didn't fade. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in my own house. I think about it sometimes still, about how close I came to never noticing. If the sun hadn't hit that one knot at the right angle, I would have stayed there the whole weekend, never realizing every move I made was being seen, maybe even broadcast somewhere. The scariest part isn't the cameras themselves. It's knowing that someone put them there on purpose with patience and planning, and that I'll never really know who was on the other side of those lenses or what they did with what they saw. I rented a cabin in northern Michigan for a week in late summer. The place sat on the edge of a quiet lake, tucked back from a dirt road that wound through heavy woods. It looked like the kind of spot people used to escape to in the 1960s and never updated. A small wooden dock stretched into the water, and the cabin itself was simple, with peeling paint on the trim and a screened-in porch that smelled faintly of damp wood. I didn't mind that it was dated. In fact, I liked the idea of being somewhere that felt a little forgotten. Inside, the cabin was basic, just one floor with a living room, kitchen, 2 small bedrooms, and a bathroom. The floors creaked, the doors stuck, and the furniture sagged, but it was enough. What struck me most was how low it sat on the ground. The base of the cabin almost touched the dirt, with only a few inches of space between the foundation and the earth. There was no crawl space, no basement, just a low wooden box on the shore of the lake. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I swam in the lake, cooked on the small stove, and sat outside until the mosquitoes drove me back indoors. The sounds at night were what you'd expect. Frogs, insects, the occasional splash of a fish. It was peaceful. On the third night, things changed. It was past midnight when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The cabin was dark and still, the lake outside black and quiet. Then I heard it, a metallic bang, sharp and hollow, from somewhere beneath the floor. I sat up, listening. At first, I thought it might have been something falling in the kitchen, but then it came again. A heavy metal slam, followed by a pause, then another. It sounded exactly like a hatch door being thrown open and then dropped shut. The noise reverberated through the floorboards. My first thought was confusion. The cabin didn't have a basement or crawl space. There wasn't supposed to be anything under me but dirt. Yet the banging was clear, deliberate, and close. I lay frozen in bed, listening to it repeat over and over. Bang, pause, bang. Sometimes quick, sometimes spaced out, as if someone were testing it, opening and closing it again and again. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe pipes? But the cabin barely had plumbing, and pipes didn't sound like that. Maybe an animal? But no raccoon or possum could make a noise that heavy and metallic. The sound continued on and off for hours. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again. I barely slept, lying there tense, waiting for it. The next morning, I went outside to check. I walked around the cabin slowly, crouching down to look beneath the edges. The structure sat almost flush with the ground. There was no crawl space, no vent, no access hatch. Just low wooden siding pressed against dirt and weeds. I circled the whole building twice, looking for any sign of metal. Nothing. It didn't make sense. I told myself maybe I had been half dreaming. Maybe the old cabin had shifted and groaned in a way that sounded like banging. I tried to convince myself of that all day, though it never really sat right in my mind. That night, I made sure to stay up later. I sat in the living room with a book, listening to the night settle around me. At first, everything was normal. The hum of insects outside, the soft lap of water against the dock. Then, sometime past midnight, it began again. The first bang jolted through the floor so hard I felt it in my feet. A metallic slam, loud and distinct. Then another, faster. I froze, staring down at the wood beneath the rug, as if I could see through it. The sound wasn't distant. It was directly beneath the cabin under the living room, a hatch opening and closing, over and over, sometimes slow, sometimes rapid, as if whoever or whatever was doing it couldn't decide whether to come through or stay hidden. I turned off the lights, sitting in the dark, my heart hammering. The noise went on for nearly an hour, off and on, before tapering off into silence. The following morning, I searched again, more thoroughly. I looked along the shoreline near where the cabin met the lake. I pushed aside weeds, crawled on hands and knees to check the foundation, even pulled back some of the loose boards near the porch. Still nothing. No hatch, no door, no sign of metal anywhere. It unsettled me more that I couldn't find proof. If there had been some kind of old storm cellar, at least it would explain it. But there wasn't. The cabin had no space underneath. The floor sat nearly flush with the earth. That night was worse. The banging started earlier, before midnight. Louder than before, almost violent. The whole floor trembled with each slam. I sat rigid in bed, gripping the sheets, listening to the rhythm of metal clanging against wood. It wasn't random anymore. It was patterned: 3 bangs, pause, then 2. Then silence. Then another set, like signals. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but the thought of walking outside in the dark made me feel exposed. If something was beneath the cabin, I didn't want to meet it alone on the ground. I stayed put, listening until exhaustion pulled me under. When daylight came, I was already packed. I couldn't shake the unease. My whole body ached from tension. I loaded my bag into the car, then did one last circle around the cabin. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the back corner, where the grass grew thick, the soil was disturbed. A patch of dirt darker than the rest, loose and freshly moved. I crouched down, brushing it with my hand. The earth crumbled easily, damp and soft. As I dug a little, my fingernails hit something solid, metal. Cold, rusted, and flat. I froze. The earth had been shifted recently, but someone had tried to cover it. I brushed more away and saw the outline of what looked like a square, maybe 2 feet across. A hatch, hidden beneath the dirt and grass, right under the corner of the cabin. The banging hadn't been my imagination. Someone or something had been opening and closing that hatch all night, directly beneath where I had been sitting and sleeping. I didn't open it. Couldn't. My hands shook too badly, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to get away. I stood up fast, wiping dirt from my hands, and went straight to the car. As I drove away, I kept replaying the sound in my head, that heavy slam over and over. The fact that the hatch had been hidden disturbed me even more. Whoever built the cabin must have known it was there, yet it was never mentioned in the rental listing. Why bury it? And why was it being used at night? I never got an answer. I didn't report it, didn't call the owner, didn't ask anyone local. I just left and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up with the echo of that sound in my head. Metal slamming shut beneath my feet, steady and deliberate. And I can't help but wonder what was waiting on the other side of that hatch, and why it only tried to come through when the lights were out. When I booked the cabin in Utah, I imagined peace and quiet. The photos showed a small wooden place tucked into trees, not far from a ridge where you could see the valley stretch for miles. I pictured sitting on the porch with a beer, hiking during the day, and sleeping soundly at night. The drive there was long but steady, winding up dirt roads until the GPS told me I had arrived. The cabin sat on a slight rise, its porch looking out toward the mountains. At first glance, everything seemed right. The air was sharp and dry, the sky wide, and the woods around me silent. I hauled my duffel bag from the car, already tired, and went straight for the front door. The lock was an older brass one, but the code worked fine. When I stepped inside, the smell of wood and dust hit me. It wasn't unpleasant, just the kind of smell you expect in a cabin that doesn't get much use. The living room had a stone fireplace, 2 worn couches, and a coffee table marked with rings from old mugs. A couple of deer antlers hung on the wall, and a rug stretched across the wooden floor. It felt exactly like what I had hoped for, until I walked down the hall to the bedroom. The door was half shut, which struck me as strange because most rentals I'd stayed in left everything wide open for guests. When I pushed it open, the first thing I noticed wasn't the bed, but a duffel bag on the floor beside it. It wasn't mine. Dark green canvas, scuffed, with a broken zipper tab. Beside it lay a pile of dirty clothes, the kind of heap you'd expect in the corner of someone's actual room, not a vacation cabin. Socks, a couple of shirts, jeans stained with something dark like grease or mud. The smell of sweat clung to the air, heavy and sour. I froze. My bag was still by the front door, untouched. No one had told me about anyone else being here. I looked around more carefully and saw boots under the bed, mud still caked on the soles. An empty water bottle sat on the nightstand, along with a crumpled wrapper from a protein bar. These weren't things left behind from months ago. They were fresh. Someone had been staying here, maybe still was. I backed out of the room slowly, trying not to make noise. My heart was hammering. The thought of someone hiding in another part of the cabin dug into me, and I suddenly became aware of how quiet the place was. Too quiet. I listened hard, trying to catch the sound of breathing, shifting, anything. Nothing came, just the faint creak of the building settling in the wind. I considered leaving right then, but my car was parked in plain sight outside. If someone was still around, they'd see me. The thought of walking back to the car with my back exposed to the trillion was worse than staying inside. I locked the bedroom door from the outside. Thankfully, the knob had a simple catch, and went back to the living room. I sat on the couch trying to think. Whoever had been staying there wasn't supposed to be. The owner would have told me if it was a shared place, which meant they were either squatting or using it without permission. Maybe they were gone for now, but there was no way of knowing when they might come back. I checked the kitchen next. The fridge wasn't empty. A carton of eggs sat on the middle shelf, dated less than a week ago. A pack of lunch meat half gone. A jug of water with fingerprints on the plastic. The cabinets held a couple of canned goods, but what caught my eye was the bag of chips on the counter, rolled down with a rubber band. Again, fresh. Someone was treating this place like their own home. I went to the bathroom. A toothbrush sat by the sink, damp at the tip as if it had been used that morning. A towel hung over the shower rod, still smelling faintly of mildew and soap. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just an old mess left behind. Someone had slept here, eaten here, showered here, maybe within hours of my arrival. The cabin had one more room, a small utility space off the back. When I opened the door, I found more signs. Another duffel bag, smaller, half-zipped, stuffed with more clothing and what looked like a sleeping bag. A box of shotgun shells sat on the floor beside it. My throat tightened when I saw that. No gun, but the ammo was enough to make me sweat. Whoever this person was, they might be armed. At that point, I didn't care about my things. I wanted to get out. I grabbed my keys from the table, but before I could leave, I caught something from the corner of my eye through the window. The tree behind the cabin swayed slightly, though there was no wind. I froze again, crouched down low, watching. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then I saw it, a figure slipping between the trees. Tall, shoulders hunched, dressed in dark clothing. They were close, too close. I ducked down behind the couch, trying to stay hidden. My car was parked right in the open. If I ran for it, they'd see me. My mind raced. I could lock myself in the cabin, but if they had a weapon, doors and windows wouldn't mean much. The sound of my own breathing felt too loud. I waited, trying to track the figure's movement. But after that glimpse, I couldn't spot them again. The trees stood still. I decided I had no choice. I slipped to the back of the cabin, where a narrow path led down toward the lake. The ground was soft with pine needles, which muffled my steps. I moved as quietly as I could, crouching low, clutching my keys so tight my hand hurt. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. Every sound made me jump. The snap of a twig, the call of a bird, the rush of water nearby. When I reached the lake, I cut around the shore, staying low among the rocks and brush. From there, I could see the cabin again, its wooden walls standing still against the trees. For a moment, I thought I'd gotten away clean. Then the front door opened. The man stepped out. Same hunched shoulders, same dark clothing. He looked around slowly, scanning the area like he expected to find someone. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this before, someone used to slipping in and out of places that weren't his. He stood on the porch for a long time, just staring into the woods. I stayed frozen, afraid to even breathe, watching him from my hidden spot. Finally, he went back inside, closing the door behind him. I didn't wait. I took the long way back toward the road, keeping off the path and moving through the trees until I could see where I'd left the car. My pulse was a drum in my ears. The vehicle sat untouched, sunlight glinting off the windshield. I bolted for it, not caring about the noise anymore, unlocked it, and jumped inside. The engine roared louder than I wanted, but I didn't stop to check the mirrors. I tore down the dirt road, dust flying behind me, not slowing until I was miles away. Later, when I reached a small town, I stopped at a gas station to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking as I explained what I'd found to the sheriff's office. They sent someone up to check, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. The bags, the food, the ammo, they were all cleared out. The cabin looked as if no one had touched it in weeks. What stayed with me wasn't just the fact that someone had been living there, but how quickly they had vanished once I left. Like they were used to it, like it wasn't the first time. Somewhere out there, that man is still moving from place to place, slipping into cabins when no one's around, leaving before he's caught. And I know how close I came to walking in on him before he was ready. I never went back to that cabin. I never will. Just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. I'd gone there for peace and quiet, but what I found instead was the kind of silence that means you're not alone, no matter how empty the place seems. When I rented the cabin in Georgia, I wanted quiet. It sat deep in the woods, far from the road, with a porch that faced a thick wall of pines. The kind of place where you could hear crickets at night and nothing else. The first day passed the way I hoped it would. Hiking in the morning, sitting by the lake in the afternoon, cooking a simple meal in the evening. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, the kind of smell that seeps into your clothes. That first night, I stepped out onto the porch before bed. The trees stood tall and still in the dark. A thin mist hung low to the ground, catching faint silver light from the moon. I sat in a chair and let the cool air wash over me. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a reflection, a tiny red flash deep in the woods. It blinked once, then went dark. I leaned forward, trying to see better, but the trees swallowed it. I figured it was nothing, maybe the tail light of a car through the woods, though the nearest road was far. I went back inside and didn't think much more about it. The second night, I noticed it again. This time there were two of them, small red lights, sharp against the dark, like pinpricks floating between the trunks. They didn't stay still. They blinked in different spots, almost like they were weaving around the trees. My first thought was hunters. Maybe someone was using headlamps with red filters, but they were too quiet. No voices, no footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just the lights winking on and off like something watching. I shut the curtains that night and tried to sleep, but the image stuck in my head. Two red dots, floating, moving. On the third night, I stepped out onto the porch again, more curious than afraid. The woods were black as ink, the air still, almost heavy. First, nothing stirred. Then the lights appeared. Not two this time, three. They blinked in different places, one higher up than the others, like it was perched in the branches. I held my breath, staring. They didn't shine steadily. They pulsed like a heartbeat. I stayed out there longer than I should have, watching, and I realized something that made my chest tighten. Each night, the lights were closer to the cabin. The first night, they were deep in the trees, far enough that I had to squint. The second night, they were halfway in. Now they were at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the porch light's reach. I went inside and locked the door. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up. I kept checking the windows, pulling the curtains tighter. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, but a noise woke me not long after, a soft tapping. At first I thought it was a branch against the siding, but the sound was too deliberate. Tap, pause, tap tap, like fingers on wood. I didn't move from the bed. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo through the room. The tapping went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. I lay awake until dawn, every muscle stiff. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The dirt around the porch looked disturbed, though it was hard to tell for sure. No clear footprints, just patches where the pine needles seemed shifted aside. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe raccoons nosing around. But deep down, I knew the tapping hadn't been random. That evening, I considered packing up and leaving, but part of me wanted answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I left without knowing, I'd never stop thinking about it. So I stayed. When darkness fell, I sat at the window instead of the porch. I turned off all the lights inside, sitting in the shadow, watching the tree line. Hours seemed to pass in silence until finally, they appeared again. The red lights, closer than ever. This time, they weren't just near the edge of the trees. They were in the clearing itself, flickering between the trunks like someone pacing back and forth. My mouth went dry. The lights bobbed slightly, never still. Then slowly they inched closer, 10 feet at a time, pausing, then moving again. They were careful, almost deliberate, like whoever held them was testing how near they could get without me reacting. I backed away from the window, keeping low. My hand shook as I reached for my phone. No signal. The cabin was too deep in the woods. I felt trapped, like a rabbit in a snare. The lights kept moving until they were just outside the cabin, no more than 20 feet from the porch. They blinked in unison now, steady, pulsing. My chest felt tight. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside. They wanted me to see them. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, clutching the heaviest thing I could find. A fireplace poker. Every few minutes, I checked the windows. The lights stayed outside for hours, steady, unblinking, like sentries. Just before dawn, they disappeared into the trees. When the sun came up, I went outside, careful, heart still racing. The clearing looked the same as always. No lights, no gear left behind. But in the dirt by the porch, I found something that chilled me worse than the sight of those lights. A cigarette, but still fresh, the filter stained dark. And beside it, the faint outline of a boot print pressed into the soil. That was all the proof I needed. Those lights weren't animals. They weren't random. They were people. Someone had been out there night after night, moving closer, watching, testing how far they could push before I broke. I didn't even go back inside. I got in my car, tossed my bag in the back seat, and drove until I hit a main road. The cabin owner never got a full explanation from me. I just said there was a problem and left it at that. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Hunters, squatters, or something else entirely. But I know what I saw. Small red lights closer each night until they were right outside the cabin. And the thought that keeps me awake sometimes is simple. If I'd stayed one more night, maybe I wouldn't have woken up at all. I had booked a small cabin in rural Pennsylvania for a long weekend. The kind of quiet getaway where I could breathe, read, hike a little, and just be away from the weight of everyday life. The cabin was simple, one story with siding, a porch with 2 old rocking chairs. It sat at the edge of a wide clearing that sloped into a thick forest of bare oaks and pines. It was early spring, still cold enough at night to see your breath, and the ground was soft with thawing earth and patches of leftover snow. The first day was uneventful. I arrived late afternoon, hauled my bag inside, and got the fire going in the wood stove. I cooked a simple dinner, sat with a book, and fell asleep to the popping of the fire. The quiet was thick out there, the kind of silence that presses in until you can hear your own heartbeat. It was almost too quiet, but I told myself that's what I came for. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight filtered pale and weak through the blinds. I made coffee, the bitter smell filling the cabin, and went to the window that faced the tree line. I don't know what drew my eyes there immediately. Maybe just the natural instinct to look outside when you're so isolated. But when I did, my stomach turned. At the edge of the trees, maybe 50 yards away, a figure stood, perfectly still. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a stump, or maybe a hunter in gear. But then the details came into focus. It was a person, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing plain dark clothes, and on their face a plastic mask, white, blank except for holes where the eyes and mouth should be. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my mouth. My brain scrambled to explain it. A neighbor? A prank? But the cabin had no neighbors close by, and nothing about the way that figure stood there was playful. They weren't moving. They weren't waving. They were just standing, facing me, watching. I stepped back from the window instinctively, pressing against the wall, heart pounding. I waited, listening. The woods stayed silent. No footsteps, no rustle. When I leaned forward again, careful, the figure was still there. Same place, same mask, just watching. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe more. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked back into the trees. Not fast, not slow, just steady, disappearing into the shadows until there was nothing left but the bare gray trunks. The rest of that morning, I couldn't think straight. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see the mask again. My coffee went cold on the counter. Every sound outside made my shoulders tense. I told myself it had to be someone messing around. Maybe kids from town, maybe some hiker. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Something about the way that person stood there made it feel intentional, pointed. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I had driven hours to get there. A stubborn part of me wanted to brush it off, pretend it was nothing, not let fear ruin the trip. So I stayed. The day passed slowly. I walked down to the creek, but I couldn't shake the image of that mask. Every tree I passed, I expected to see someone behind it. When I got back to the cabin, I checked every door and window twice. By the time night came, I was exhausted but too wired to rest. I lit the fire, sat with my back to the wall, and tried to read, but every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the windows. The glass reflected the inside of the cabin too much to see outside clearly. I hated that. It made me feel blind. At some point, I must have dozed off in the chair. I woke to a sound outside, soft, deliberate, like someone stepping on wet leaves. My body went rigid. The fire had burned low, throwing only faint light. The sound came again, closer this time, just beyond the porch. I didn't move. I sat in the chair, every muscle tight, listening. Then silence. Long, stretched silence. Finally, I stood slowly and went to the window, careful to stay low. I pulled the curtain back an inch. The clearing looked empty in the weak moonlight. No movement, no figure, but the fear didn't leave. I backed away, locked the bedroom door, and sat awake until dawn. The next morning, I told myself again I should leave. But another part of me, stubborn, reckless, wanted to see if it would happen again. I wanted to know. I spent that day restless, couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking the tree line, scanning for movement. Hours dragged by. As the sun set, the woods seemed to grow heavier, pressing in closer. And then it happened again. I was standing at the sink when I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. The figure, same spot as before, same dark clothes, same plastic mask. Watching, my throat tightened. The mask caught the fading light, pale and smooth, almost glowing. The figure didn't move. Not a step, not a tilt of the head. Just stood there. I didn't wait this time. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything in haphazardly, and loaded it into the car. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys once. When I finally got the engine started, I didn't look back at the cabin. I drove down the dirt road fast enough that gravel spat out behind me, the trees blurring past on both sides. When I reached the highway, I pulled over to breathe. My hands were still trembling on the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror out of instinct. Just woods stretching behind me, no sign of the mask. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told the owner exactly why I left. Just said I had to cut the trip short. But the memory stayed sharp. That pale mask against the dark trees, the stillness of the figure, the certainty that whoever it was, they wanted me to know I was being watched. The part that sticks with me most isn't the figure itself. It's the way they disappeared back into the woods the first morning. Calm, deliberate, like they weren't in a hurry. like they knew they'd be back. And when I think about it now, I can't help but wonder if I'd stayed another night, if I'd waited just a little longer. Would I have woken up to that mask not at the edge of the trees, but pressed against the cabin window? I rented a small cabin deep in Oregon's forest because I wanted peace. It was the kind of place you had to plan for. Miles of winding dirt roads, tall firs and pines closing in overhead, no cell service once you got more than a few miles out. The cabin itself was simple. One room with a bed, a small table, and a wood stove. It sat on the edge of a clearing, and beyond that was nothing but endless dark forest. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I cooked a meal, sat on the porch until the sun went down, and listened to the trees creak in the wind. When I finally went to bed, the kind of silence I thought I wanted felt heavier than I expected. Every little noise, the pop of the wood stove, the scrape of a branch outside, stood out sharp. I eventually drifted off, but sometime after midnight I woke to something that froze me. It was the sound of crying, faint, distant, but clear. The sound of a child, a small voice, thin and wavering, drifting through the trees. I lay still, staring into the dark ceiling beams, my chest tight. At first I thought I was dreaming, but the more I listened, the more certain I became. It wasn't imagination, it was real. The crying rose and fell, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. It lasted maybe 5 minutes, then faded completely. I sat awake the rest of the night, waiting for it to return. It never did. By morning, I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe a family was camping nearby. Maybe the sound carried farther than I thought. But a nagging part of me wondered why I hadn't heard footsteps, voices, or anything else. Just the crying. The second night, it happened again. I had just drifted into that light stage of sleep when it started. The same thin, broken wail of a child, carrying through the trees. It came from one side of the cabin, then shifted to another, as if whoever it was moving through the woods. I sat up in bed, my skin crawling. I wanted to go to the door, to look, but something in me resisted. The sound was wrong somehow. Not just the crying itself, but the way it stayed at the edge of hearing, never close enough to identify, never fading completely away. It went on longer that night, maybe 10 minutes, then cut off as suddenly as it started. I barely slept after that. My ears strained for the sound until dawn finally came. The next day, I hiked to the ranger station about 3 miles down the trail. I tried to sound casual, asking if there were families staying nearby, maybe with kids. The ranger gave me a strange look and shook his head. He told me most of the cabins were empty that week. The nearest family he knew of was miles away. He said it flat, certain. No kids anywhere near where I was. I didn't tell him exactly what I'd been hearing. I just nodded and went back. But the walk to the cabin felt different. The trees seemed taller, darker, and the air colder. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lantern. I sat on the edge of the bed, waiting, and sure enough, just past midnight, the crying began again. This time it was closer, too close. The sound came from the clearing itself, just beyond the walls. The thin wail rose and fell, a noise that cut straight through me. My hands were sweating, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I sat frozen, gripping the edge of the mattress, listening. The crying circled the cabin, first by the window, then shifting toward the porch, then to the back wall. Each time it moved, the sound was clearer, sharper, as if whoever it was dragging themselves slowly through the clearing. I wanted to yell, to tell them to stop, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I sat in the dim light of the lantern, waiting, every nerve screaming. After maybe 15 minutes, the crying stopped. Silence pressed back in, heavier than before. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun finally came, I stepped outside, my body tense and stiff. The clearing was empty. No sign of footprints, no sign of anyone moving around the cabin. The ground was soft enough it should have shown something, but there was nothing, not a single mark. I told myself again it had to be some kind of trick. Sound carried strangely in the woods. Maybe an animal, maybe the wind, but deep down I knew better. The fourth night was the worst. I left every light in the cabin burning, though it barely cut into the dark pressing against the windows. I sat up in the chair by the stove, forcing myself to stay awake. Midnight came and went in silence, and I almost thought maybe it wouldn't happen. Then the crying began, louder than before, sharp and desperate, as if it was right outside the window. The sound pierced through the glass, through the walls, filling the cabin. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I gripped the arm of the chair, staring at the door, expecting it to open at any second. The crying didn't stay still this time. It moved fast, circling, weaving, sometimes right against the wall, sometimes farther away. At one point, it came directly from the porch. The boards creaked under weight, soft but undeniable. I held my breath, my ears straining. The crying didn't fade this time. It grew sharper, more insistent, as if whoever was making it wanted to be let in. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything I could into it, and bolted for the door. The crying stopped the instant I opened it, cut off like a switch. The clearing lay under pale moonlight, empty and still. The tree line loomed, silent and black. I didn't look long. I ran to the car, tossed my bag inside, and started the engine with shaking hands. I drove the dirt road faster than I should have, the trees blurring past, every shadow at the edge of my headlights making my stomach clench. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Later, I learned more from the rangers. They told me other campers had reported the same thing in that area for years. Hearing a child crying outside their cabins at night, always circling, always just out of reach, and always in a place where there were no children anywhere near. That was enough for me. I never went back to that part of Oregon, and I don't plan to. What haunts me most isn't the sound itself, though that memory still makes my skin crawl. It's the moment when I opened the cabin door, when the crying cut off like it had been waiting for me to make that move. And I still wonder, if I hadn't left that night, if I had stayed in the cabin until dawn, would the crying have stayed outside, or would it have finally come in? I remember that trip to Minnesota clearer than I'd like to. We'd gone up there for a fishing weekend, a group of us who wanted a quiet break away from everything. The cabin we rented was tucked back off a gravel road, surrounded by tall pines and the lake just a short walk downhill. It was the kind of place where you could forget about work, phones, and the rest of the world. Remote enough that you didn't expect to see strangers, but not so far out that you'd think twice about being there. We arrived late in the afternoon on a Friday. The cabin was simple but solid, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled faintly of pine cleaner, and a porch that looked out toward the water. There was nothing fancy about it, just wood-paneled walls, a brick fireplace, and worn but comfortable furniture. It felt safe in that way cabins sometimes do, like it had stood long enough to see winters harsher than we'd ever experience. That first evening we unloaded our gear, stocked the small fridge with food and beer, and sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the trees. The silence was the kind that presses in around you, broken only by the occasional bird or a faint ripple from the lake. It was perfect, exactly what we'd wanted. We went to bed early, planning to hit the lake at sunrise. The next morning, we carried our rods, tackle boxes, and a cooler down to the dock. The air was crisp, the lake perfectly still, and a thin fog drifted low across the surface. We spent hours out there, casting, laughing, sitting quietly when the bites were slow. It was the kind of day where time doesn't matter. By the time we headed back, the sun was high, and I was already thinking about frying up some of the fish we'd caught. But the moment we reached the cabin, something felt off. From a distance, I could see the front door standing wide open. At first, I thought maybe someone had left it unlatched and the wind had pushed it open. But as we got closer, I saw the side door was open too, both swinging gently in the breeze. We stopped in the yard, all of us just staring. No one wanted to be the first to walk up. My stomach sank as the thought hit me. Someone had been inside. Maybe they were still inside. The air around the cabin felt different, heavier, like the silence had changed into something tense and expectant. We crept closer, the boards of the porch creaking under our boots. I remember my hand shaking as I pushed the front door the rest of the way open. The living room was still, just as we'd left it. The chairs, the cooler, even the deck of cards on the table were untouched. But the air inside felt wrong, like the place had been disturbed, like it no longer belonged to us. Room by room we checked. The kitchen was fine, the fridge still humming, food still there. Bedrooms looked the same as when we left them, bags unzipped but untouched. Nothing missing, not even the cash some of us had left out on the dresser. The bathroom door was standing open too. The tiny window above the shower cracked as if someone had been inside and needed air. It was clear by the time we finished checking every corner. Whoever had opened the doors hadn't taken anything. They just wanted us to know they'd been there. That thought burrowed deep in my head. It would have been easier if they'd stolen something, if it was just a break-in. But the idea that a stranger had gone through the cabin without leaving a trace, opening every door, was worse. It felt like a message, though I couldn't tell what kind. We debated leaving right then, but the nearest town was a long drive and none of us wanted to admit we were scared enough to cut the trip short. So we stayed. That night we sat together, the fire in the fireplace crackling. None of us playing cards or talking much. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside, made me tense. I couldn't stop picturing someone standing out in the trees, waiting for us to fall asleep. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening. The sound of the lake lapping at the shore outside was soft, but every now and then I thought I heard twigs snapping, faint steps moving in the dark. I told myself it was deer, raccoons, anything but a person. Still, I stayed awake until the first light pushed through the curtains. The next morning, the doors were still closed, just how we left them. That gave us a false sense of comfort. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe some curious local kids had wandered through while we were gone. That's what we told ourselves as we packed our gear for another day of fishing. But I couldn't focus on the water. I kept glancing back toward the tree line, scanning the shoreline, expecting to see movement. My nerves were shot. When we returned to the cabin later that afternoon, everything was as it should be. Doors shut, nothing touched. That should have helped, but instead it made the first day feel even stranger, like an isolated event designed to unsettle us. On our last night, sitting by the fire again, the thought kept circling in my head. Whoever had been there knew when we'd be gone. They knew when to come in and when to leave. Maybe they were watching us from the woods, keeping track. Maybe they'd done it to other renters too, testing boundaries, seeing how much they could get away with. The next morning we packed up, loaded the truck, and left. None of us said much on the drive home. The silence wasn't from being tired, it was from not wanting to talk about what happened. Later, when I looked back on it, the scariest part wasn't that someone had broken in. It wasn't even that nothing was stolen. It was that they wanted us to know. The open doors were deliberate, a signal that we weren't alone out there. Whoever it was had been inside our space, moving through it while we were gone, and chose to leave everything just as it was, except for the doors. That cabin felt safe when we first arrived, tucked away in the woods by the lake. But by the time we left, it was ruined in my head. The memory of those doors swinging open in the breeze is burned into me. I don't know who did it or why, but I know we were being watched. And that thought follows me more than anything else. Even now, I think about it at night sometimes. How easy it is for someone to walk into a place you think of as safe, to leave no trace except a reminder that safety is only in your head. And I don't think I'll ever rent a cabin that remote again. I booked a cabin in the woods of Idaho because I wanted quiet. I had been working too much, staring at screens for too long, and I felt like I needed something stripped down, far away from city noise. The drive itself set the tone. Long, empty highways that gave way to narrow two-lane roads, and then finally gravel that snaked through the trees. The further I went, the fewer houses I saw until there were none. The cabin was small, older, with a tin roof that looked like it had taken some beatings from weather over the years. It sat on a clearing with tall pines pressed tight on every side. The air was damp and sharp with that smell of pine needles and earth. The first day I settled in, everything felt normal. I made a fire in the wood stove, unpacked some food I had brought, and walked around the property just to get a sense of it. There was a trail that led off into the trees behind the cabin, but it didn't look well used. The ground was covered in a layer of pine needles, and there weren't many boot prints or marks of regular passage. I didn't wander too far because the sun was already dropping and the air was cooling fast. I went back inside, read for a bit, and went to sleep early, thinking the trip would just be a quiet retreat. The second day, I woke up and cooked breakfast on the small propane stove. After that, I decided to check more of the area behind the cabin, curious about where that faint trail might go. I walked slow, pushing branches out of the way, following it deeper until I noticed something strange. Not far from the cabin, maybe only 100 yards into the trees, there was a tent. It didn't look abandoned or collapsed. It was fully set up with 2 sleeping bags laid out inside. The zippers were half open, and it looked like someone had just stepped away. There was no mold or mildew, no leaves collected on top, which meant it hadn't been sitting there long. A cooler sat beside it, closed tight, and a couple of camp chairs folded and leaned against a tree. Everything about it suggested that people were coming back, but no one ever did. At first, I thought maybe the tent belonged to someone who had rented the cabin before me. Maybe they set up a spot in the woods and forgot their gear. But the thing was too fresh. The sleeping bags didn't have that matted, damp look. The cooler didn't have dirt stuck to it. Even the chairs had been placed neatly. It looked like it had been put there the night before. I walked a circle around the camp, looking for any footprints, but the ground was soft and patchy. Pine needles covered almost everything, and where there was dirt, I didn't see much. Just faint scuffs that didn't tell me much at all. I unzipped the cooler, and inside were bottles of water, sandwich bread, some lunch meat, and a pack of beer. The bread was soft and fresh, not stale. Whoever left this hadn't been gone more than a day, maybe 2. I remember standing there for a while, just trying to figure out what made sense. The cabin was isolated, but the road wasn't impossible to reach. If these people had gone hiking, wouldn't they have locked their food up? The area had bears, mountain lions, and smaller scavengers. Leaving a cooler full of food sitting out like that didn't line up with anyone who had experience camping. And why set up a tent so close to a cabin they could have stayed in? That night, I couldn't get the image of the tent out of my head. I kept thinking about those 2 sleeping bags. They looked like they were waiting for people. I didn't hear anything outside. No footsteps, no cars, not even distant voices. Just the trees swaying and the occasional creak of the cabin. I left the blinds closed and sat up later than usual, listening. On the 3rd day, I went back again. The tent hadn't changed. Nothing was moved. I touched the sleeping bags and they were still dry, still clean. The cooler still had the same food. It was unsettling in a way I can't explain well. It wasn't just the emptiness, it was the expectation, the sense that someone should have been there. I kept thinking of people walking into the trees and never coming back out. I thought about packing up and leaving. The cabin had been fine until then, but the tent gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the unease that came with knowing it was there. I even tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that whoever had set it up must have moved on, that it wasn't my business. But I kept drifting back behind the cabin, drawn to it like I was checking if it had changed. Each time it was the same. 2 sleeping bags, a cooler of food, no people. By the 4th day, I couldn't take it. I drove down the gravel road until I had enough of a signal to call the sheriff's office. I told them what I found, explained it wasn't my gear, that it looked too new to be abandoned. They said they would send someone out, but I wasn't sure how long that would take. I drove back, uneasy the whole way. That night, sitting in the cabin, I felt like the woods were holding their breath. The silence seemed heavier, stretched too tight. I thought about the tent again. I thought about walking over there with a flashlight, checking if anything had changed since the afternoon. But I didn't. I stayed inside, locked the door, and lay in bed listening to every noise. The next morning, I walked back, half dreading what I might see. The tent was still there, still untouched. But something caught my eye in the dirt near the cooler. A small scatter of tracks, pressed shallow into the ground. They weren't boots or shoes. They looked like barefoot prints, small, thin, heading off into the trees in no clear direction. I didn't stay after that. I packed my things quickly, loaded my car, and drove back to town. When I got to the sheriff's office, I explained everything again. They sent someone out, but when I followed up later, they told me the tent was gone. Not collapsed, not taken down properly, just gone. No cooler, no sleeping bags, no chairs. Nothing. To this day, I don't know what happened to the people who set it up. Maybe they left in the middle of the night and carried everything off. Maybe something pulled them deeper into the woods, and someone else came back to clean up. I'll never know. What I do know is that I'll never rent a cabin that remote again. That empty tent, set up behind the cabin like it was waiting, burned itself into my memory. It wasn't the sight of it that stuck with me most, though. It was the silence around it, the absence of anyone who should have been there, the cooler of fresh food untouched, the sleeping bags never used again. When I think back on it now, the strangest part isn't that no one came back to claim it. It's that it looked like they had just stepped away for a minute, and yet they never returned. That kind of unfinished story, sitting there in the woods, doesn't leave your head. It follows you. It makes you wonder if one night you might unzip a tent and find nothing but a hollow space where people should be, and no explanation waiting for you anywhere. I rented a small cabin in North Carolina for a month because I needed time away from the noise of my regular life. It sat on the edge of a dense patch of woods, tucked away from the nearest road by a half-mile of gravel. The cabin itself was old but clean enough. Wooden floors, one bedroom, a little kitchen with an old stove, and a porch that faced the trees. The thing that made me feel safe about it was the heavy lock on the front door. It was a thick, solid deadbolt, the kind you twist from the inside. Every night, I made sure to turn it, test it, and hear the firm click before I went to bed. The first morning, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The lock was on the floor, not broken, not damaged, just sitting there neatly, like someone had twisted it off and set it down. I stared at it for a long time, thinking maybe I had done something wrong. Maybe I hadn't secured it right. Maybe it had slipped somehow. But that lock wasn't loose. I remembered how solid it felt the night before. I picked it up, slid it back into place, and tested it again. It held tight just like it was supposed to. I tried tugging on it, rattling the knob, pushing and pulling the door. It didn't budge. I chalked it up to some kind of mistake on my part, but the thought bothered me the whole day. That night, I locked it again, tested it again, and even pushed a chair against the door just for my own peace of mind. When I woke the next morning, the lock was back on the floor. The chair hadn't moved. The door was shut. The windows were all still latched. It made no sense. For the next several nights, it kept happening. I would lock the door, check it more times than necessary, and every morning the lock would be on the floor again. It wasn't like it was thrown or dropped. It was always resting neatly on the wood, just a few inches inside the door, as if placed there carefully. That was what got to me the most. Someone or something was taking it off quietly and leaving it for me to find. I started inspecting the door itself. I ran my fingers over the wood, looking for marks, scratches, anything that showed tampering. Nothing. I checked the hinges. They were fine. I checked the frame. Solid. The only thing out of place was the lock on the floor each morning. My sleep got worse. I would lie there, tense, listening to every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside. The woods were thick and full of noises, owls, wind, sometimes the sound of branches snapping. Every sound made me wonder if someone was outside. I got up a few times in the night to check, but I never caught anything. The mornings were always the same. The lock on the floor, no other sign of disturbance. By the second week, I was on edge. I started trying to set little traps to see if anyone was coming inside. I put a thin layer of flour on the floor by the door, thinking it would catch footprints. In the morning, the lock was on the floor again, but there were no prints. I balanced a mug carefully on the doorknob one night, thinking it would fall if anyone moved it. The next morning, the mug was still balanced exactly where I left it. The lock, though, was on the ground again. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each day. I would sit on the porch, looking out at the trees, and I swore sometimes I saw movement between the trunks, just at the edge of my vision. Never clear enough to identify, just the sense that something was out there. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in. I told myself if I just made it through the month, I'd leave this behind me and never come back. But by the third week, it got worse. One morning, instead of being placed neatly by the door, the lock was sitting halfway across the room, on the rug in front of the couch. I hadn't heard anything during the night. The chair I kept against the door was still pressed where I left it. It was like the lock was being moved without the door ever being touched. That day, I stayed outside most of the time. I walked the property, circled the cabin again and again, looking for signs of anyone. The woods were silent. No camps, no trash, no footprints. Felt like the trees swallowed everything. The final night was the breaking point. I locked the door as always, checked it over and over, then sat awake in bed, determined not to sleep. The cabin was dark and silent. Around midnight, I must have drifted off despite myself, because I woke to the faintest sound, something metallic clicking softly. My heart was pounding before I even opened my eyes. I sat up and stared at the door. In the dim light coming through the window, I could just make out the outline of the lock. It was still in place. I held my breath, waiting. The silence pressed down, thick and heavy. At some point, I must have fallen asleep again. When I woke with daylight coming through the window, the lock wasn't just on the floor. It was lying right beside my bed, a few inches from where my hand had been resting in my sleep. That was enough. I packed my things in a rush, barely caring how I stuffed them into the bag. I didn't eat, didn't clean up. I loaded my car and drove out without looking back. I never went back for the rest of the rental period. I didn't even ask for my money. I just wanted distance from that place. The thing that haunts me now isn't just that the lock kept ending up on the floor. It's that last morning, finding it beside my bed. That meant someone or something had been close enough to me as I slept to place it there. Not outside the door, not at the threshold, but inside within arm's reach. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no damage, no reason. Just that silent message, repeated every morning, until it ended up right beside me. That's when I understood. The lock was never keeping anything out. It was only showing me that whatever was moving it didn't care about barriers at all. And that thought stays with me more than anything else. The sense of being watched, tested, and reminded night after night that I was never alone in that cabin. We had rented a small cabin in Colorado for a long weekend as a family getaway. It wasn't anything fancy, just a wood frame place tucked back off a gravel road with thick forest all around it. There was one main room with a stone fireplace, a little kitchen, and 2 small bedrooms. The place smelled like pine and old wood when we first unlocked the door. It felt exactly like what we wanted. A quiet escape where we could hike, cook simple meals, and sit by a fire in the evenings. On the second day, we decided to take one of the longer trails that looped through the mountains behind the cabin. We packed snacks and water, locked up, and set out mid-morning. The hike took hours, and by the time we were on the return stretch, all of us were tired, hungry, and ready to sit down and rest. The sun was starting to sink behind the peaks, painting the treetops gold, when we finally came back up the gravel drive to the cabin. Nothing seemed strange at first. The place looked exactly the way we had left it. But the moment we pushed open the front door, I smelled it. Smoke. Not just the lingering smell of past fires, but fresh smoke. Sharp, woody, and alive. There was also another odor underneath, heavier and more unsettling. Meat. Raw meat. We stepped inside, and my stomach tightened. The fireplace was burning. Someone had built a fresh fire inside the cabin while we were gone. On the iron grate over the flames, strips of raw red meat had been laid out. They weren't cooked through, just searing on one side, the edges curling from the heat. Grease dripped into the flames, popping and hissing. We froze. The place had been locked when we left. None of us had left anything out, and there hadn't been a fire in that fireplace since the night before. Yet there it was, burning strong with food cooking on it. I looked around fast. The chairs were where we had left them. The bags we had packed still sat on the counter. Nothing looked rifled through, nothing missing. It was as if someone had come in, lit the fire, laid the meat down, and then walked back out. I felt the air in my chest go tight. Whoever had done this had known we weren't inside. They had time to build a fire and start cooking without rushing. That meant they had probably been watching us leave. We didn't linger. None of us said a word as we backed out of the cabin, my eyes darting over the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there watching. The woods looked empty, but the feeling of eyes on us was thick. We got in the car and sat there, unsure of what to do. After several long minutes, we decided to drive down the mountain into the nearest town. It was a long way, but none of us wanted to stay close to the cabin. By the time we got to the main road and reached town, night had fallen. We ate at a diner, though none of us had much appetite, and eventually returned to the cabin because we had left everything inside. When we opened the door again, the fire had burned low to embers. The meat was still on the grate, now half charred and dried, the smell filling the entire cabin. Nobody had been inside while we were gone this time, or at least nothing else looked touched. But the fact that the meat was still there meant whoever had cooked it never intended to eat it. That thought bothered me more than anything. It wasn't a meal, it was a message. That night, none of us slept well. The forest outside was pitch black, and the cabin's thin walls did little to make us feel safe. Every creak made me sit up. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. I kept replaying the image of that meat cooking on the fire, the grease spitting into the flames, the smell of it hitting me the moment we opened the door. The next morning, we packed up faster than I thought possible. We loaded the car, locked the cabin, and drove away without looking back. Even now, what unsettles me most is not knowing who it was or why they did it. They hadn't stolen anything, hadn't vandalized, hadn't harmed us directly. They had simply come into our space, built a fire, and laid raw meat on the grate, as if to show us they could. It wasn't about food. It wasn't about shelter. It was about presence. Proof that someone else was out there, someone who could walk into that cabin anytime they wanted, no matter what we did to stop them. And that's the part that sticks with me. The woods are full of noises, full of life, but the thought that there are people living just outside of sight, watching, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. It's worse than any animal you could meet on a trail. That fire wasn't meant to warm anyone. That meat wasn't meant to be eaten. Both were left there for us. A reminder that even in what felt like the middle of nowhere, we weren't alone. We were never alone.